So many Christians struggle to defend the truth of the Christian worldview. What if there was a podcast dedicated to answering the toughest objections to Christianity? This is the mission of the Daily Apologist podcast. I'm your host, Dean Meadows, and on this episode, I begin a series on the resurrection of Jesus. I sit down and interview world-famous New Testament historian Mike Licona. In part one of our interview, we examine the subject of history and miracle. I'm here with Dr. Mike Licona, and he is going to talk to us today about the resurrection. Now, for those of us who may not know who you are, Dr. Licona, why don't you just go ahead and briefly give us your background, your expertise, things like that, so we can get to know you a little bit better.
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm 58 years old. Be 59 in a couple months. I teach New Testament and apologetics at Houston Baptist University. Let's see. I also am president of our nonprofit organization, Risen Jesus Incorporated. And so I teach several courses at HBU. I also do a lot of speaking around the country, sometimes outside the country, research, writing. We have a YouTube channel that is really starting to take off. They can just go to YouTube, type in my name, Mike Licona, Licona, and they'll see my YouTube channel, and then go there. And we have a lot of videos. In fact, we have a bunch coming out in just the next couple of months here. Starting April 1st of this year, 2020, every weekday through the 24th at least, we're going to be posting one video that's going to be 1 to 3 minutes in length. And then in May, we've got a bunch more coming out. So yeah, pretty excited about what we're doing here.
Outstanding. So you've done a lot of work in two specific areas. One would be the resurrection. The other one would be the historical reliability of the Gospels, some things in the New Testament. So you would classify yourself as a historian, correct?
Right. Yeah. It's just like in New Testament studies, you can, there's several, just like Bart Ehrman, his area of expertise that he started off in was textual criticism. He's one of the finest in the world today. But then he's also branched into other areas as well, like New Testament history, early church history, things like this. One can focus on theological issues and like systematic theology, all different kinds. And
Gotcha.
So I did not do that. I focused on New Testament history, but also in my doctoral research, I did a lot on the philosophy of history.
Mm-hmm.
So things like, what is history? How do we learn about how do we come to knowledge about the past? To what extent we can know the past? Burden of proof, historians and miracles, things like this, historical method. So yeah, I've done quite a bit of work and research on those matters. So,
how do we do history, but why even do history if it seems like it's so far removed from today? How can we really know what happened in the past? How can we really know, take it off of Jesus for a second, how can we even know that Caesar crossed the Rubicon, or that Alexander the Great was a historical figure? Because from the postmodern perspective, it might even say, it's really hard, difficult, maybe even nearly impossible to access things that supposedly happened in the past.
Well, just take Caesar's crossing the Rubicon, for example. We have 9 or 10 sources within, let's say, 200 years that either mention the event or allude to the event. Allude to the event, not elude, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
And 5, I believe, 5 or 6 that mention it directly. Even Julius Caesar does not mention it directly, specifically. He can mention being in, let's say, Ravenna at one point, and then Ariminum at another. In order to get there, you have to cross the Rubicon. But he doesn't actually mention coming to the Rubicon, crossing it, or pondering whether he should cross it when he gets there, as we find in Luca and um, Lucan and Suetonius and Plutarch.
So it seems like what you're saying, Dr. Lacona, is that history is different in the fact that it's not like um a science factory where I can take a little bit of this, a little bit of that. I can run it through the burner, the Bunsen burner or whatever, and I get this concoction that is perfectly made and adequate for what I'm trying to accomplish. It's much more flexible. I guess it's not like math where 2 + 2 is 4. I guess do you understand what I'm saying when I'm
Yeah.
referencing that
So
way to
things like
history?
things like physics, astrophysics,
Yeah.
cosmology, these would be kind of the hard, we could call them the hard sciences, because they're based on hard data, and you can use mathematics and things like this. When it comes to history, we could call that a soft science. There's no mathematics there. You can't plug some numbers in, do a mathematical equation, press enter, and get an answer. And of course, uh, much in biology and geology and archaeology are the same in that way too. They're soft sciences. So yeah,
So
there's
so
definitely
that's
a
a
distinction.
so that's a distinction that even as a lay Christian, or an amateur apologist, what we need to understand is that history isn't like the astrophysics and cosmology. It's much more flexible. It deals more in what probably happened. There's never there's a certain way in which we could say, okay, the inference to the best explanation with regards to this specific event is that it probably happened. It's never one of those things where, hey, I know with 100% certainty that this took place. Is that accurate? Is that
Sure.
maybe okay?
Yeah, and
Um,
the further we go back into the past, of course, it gets more and more tentative. So,
Gotcha.
if we're talking about, if a historian were to say the coronavirus became a worldwide pandemic uh,
Hmm.
in the month of March 2020, we can prove that with
Yeah, no doubt.
virtually 100% certainty. But if you go back to, you know, um, if we're talking about the foundation of Rome through a guy named Romulus, we're not even going to get close to that.
Hmm.
Um, so, and then, there's stuff in between there. So you're right. We are looking, the historian is limited by certain tools that historians have that they can use.
Okay.
Um, yeah.
So moving on now, when we're looking at history, you've specialized in the resurrection. It's your doctoral thesis. It turned out to be an amazing book, a resource that I've referenced multiple times. Since it's been published, definitely one of the best resources out there on the resurrection. I'm biased because I really really like you. You're an inspiration to me, so it's the best in my opinion. But
Thanks.
when we talk about the resurrection and we talk about history, the resurrection, by definition, is a miracle, and it seems like history operates within the realm of the natural, not supernatural. At least that might be a objection. So, how could you ever conclude that an event was the result of a miracle using the tools of history?
Yeah, well, first, when you say it's defined as a miracle, someone like John Meyer, a historian of Jesus, would take issue with that, because just of the way he defines miracle, he would say resurrection is not a miracle by his definition. Now, most people, including myself, would have, by our definition of miracle, we would say, of course, the resurrection is a miracle. But it depends how you define it. I would define miracle as an event um, that would, of necessity, have a non-natural cause of some sort. Okay, a non-natural cause, and I wouldn't have to specify it any further than that. And so, yeah, I would say that the resurrection is a miracle. So, can historians investigate miracles in that sense? And I would say, sure. There's no a priori reason that would exclude them from doing so, despite the contentions of several historians um, to the contrary. So, yeah.
So then to kind of come back at that, putting my skeptic hat on, doesn't that just open the proverbial Pandora's box of all types of absurdities that now have to be accepted if miracles are allowed to be placed in the historical arena?
Yeah,
Um,
I wouldn't agree with that. I would say, like what? And they'd say, well, do you have to believe in unicorns then? I'd say, well, of course not. Historians are still bound to go with the evidence. Um, so here's an example I like to give. There's a couple I'll throw out once in a while, but here's one that I like. Let's just suppose that some astronomers have been following a comet for the last decade, and they've determined that this comet is on a collision course with the moon and is going to collide with the moon on a certain day at a certain time. And on that day, you've got the Hubble Space Telescope and several planetariums around the world that zoom in on the lunar surface to view the event, and we see it on television. And at the appointed time, the comet slams into the moon's surface, and as the lunar dust settles, there is a message written on the moon, and it says, Jesus is Lord. And it's written in both Hebrew and in Greek. Now, that would seem to be a miracle. It would require a miracle. If astronomers look and say, hey, we do not have the technology, of course, to do this, we have no idea how this happens, an astronomer wouldn't turn around and say, well, since this is a miracle, we can't adjudicate on whether the event itself occurred. Well, of course they could. They could say the comet slammed into the moon's surface, leaving a message that said Jesus is Lord in Hebrew and in Greek. They would just say, well, we as astronomers do not have the tools to know what caused this. We don't know how it happened. It happened, yes. Did it happen? Yes. How did it happen? We leave a question mark. It's undetermined. And in the same way, a historian could do that with a miracle like the resurrection of Jesus. If we have sufficient evidence to establish that Jesus rose from the dead, and I think we do, or any miracle claim, if we have sufficient evidence to establish that it happened, the historian at least could adjudicate on that event, said whether it happened. And if there's sufficient evidence, we could say the event occurred, but the historian wouldn't have the tools to say God did it.
so then you would be moving from the historical tools and the historical case to, while this event took place, it calls into question some metaphysical or maybe even theological consideration regarding the event. But just using the strict rules of history, we can't adjudicate on what the cause is. We can simply say the event took place. Is that
That's correct.
what we're suggesting? Okay, cool.
And of
So
course, the historian or the scientist in the example of the comet hitting the moon, the scientist there, the historian with the resurrection, of course, would be free to speculate.
yeah,
No reason they can't do it. In fact, physicists speculate and come up with theoretical entities all the time, such as black holes, quark strings, gluons. No one has ever seen them. They probably never will. They are theoretical entities posited to explain observable phenomena. And if physicists can do that, then why can't historians?
well, the pushback I think from that, at least what I've experienced, is in your analogy, the skeptic would come back and say, well, we don't see comets hitting the moon and Jesus is Lord being written in Hebrew and Greek. So it's not the same as the resurrection, because the analogy, number one, doesn't happen. Number two, that analogy would be for today. We're watching it on TV, whereas the resurrection is separated by 2,000 years. So how do you bridge that gap, or how do you bridge that objection with the skeptic?
Oh, that's easy. I would just say, okay, your objection has just changed. Because first it was, in principle, historians can't investigate miracle claims. Now your claim, your objection is, yeah, but we don't have that kind of evidence for the resurrection, like a comet slamming into the moon's surface. So now it is, well, you don't have enough evidence. Now you've backed away from the principle. So I would say, okay, well, let's just go back to the comet. If that happened, would the astronomer be barred from acknowledging that the event had occurred?
No.
Of course, they would have to say, well, of course not. The astronomer could, I mean, we're witnessing it with our own eyes. We could see the comet hit the moon. We could see the message that was left behind in Hebrew and in Greek saying Jesus is Lord. We can acknowledge the data. We can acknowledge that the event occurred. We just couldn't say God did it.
Okay. So here's one more pushback for you, and then we'll move
Sure.
to part two. In the analogy of the comet hitting the moon and writing Jesus as Lord in Greek and Hebrew, couldn't the skeptic simply say, well, we need to take into consideration the most mundane explanation, or consider that this is some new phenomenon that has taken place naturally that we just don't know about yet. So it's a natural explanation, and it's a simple explanation. We just haven't discovered what that is in nature yet.
So in other words, you're not given a God of the gaps, you're given a naturalism of the gaps hypothesis.
I like that. That's interesting. Elaborate a little bit on that.
Well, it would be a naturalism of the gaps. It's you're just, first of all, that would be a metaphysical naturalism, or certainly a bias toward a natural explanation. And I would point out, well, from what we know from science today, which is quite a bit. Now, is there a lot more to learn? Absolutely. But from what we do know, it would strongly suggest that this was not a natural cause, that there was some sort of a plan, a designer behind this, because there was information that was given in that message. So, like, if I walk on the beach on a morning and I see some ripples in the sand, beautiful ripples that were put there arbitrarily by the tide going out, I look at that and I say, well, this is pretty, but it's, this is the kind of patterns that we normally affiliate with natural causes. But if I walk on the beach in the morning and I see a little sign that says Mike loves Debbie, there's information in that. And is it possible that that got there by undirected natural processes, undirected, not from intelligence, that the way the waves just kind of worked and worked out with the tide, it just formed that message? Well, from what we know, that doesn't work that way. Or just take, for example, a cornfield. If you see a field and it's all full of weeds of some sort, you can say, well, this is what the kind of things that we normally would affiliate with natural processes. But if we see a cornfield and very few weeds and all these rows that look really nice and it's all of corn, we're going to look at that and say, well, this makes a whole lot more sense that intelligent causation was behind it. And so we would do the same thing with the thing on the moon.
So I think that that's a great explanation, as far as pointing out that just as the skeptic may accuse the theist of God of the gaps, there is this thing called naturalism of the gaps. And I don't think as Christians we consider that enough when talking to our skeptical friends. And so as we conclude this first section, essentially what we've been talking about, for those who are out there are listening, is that history is not the same as a hard science. There's flexibility in history, but also there's no reason why a historian couldn't investigate miracle claims as well, and that it's not always that we should take the most mundane explanation for something like a miracle or or the resurrection of Jesus. It's, where does the evidence lead? And so in part two, what Dr. Licona and I are going to do is we're going to start looking at the evidence for the resurrection, now that we've established that history and miracles are not two separate things, but the tools of history can definitely investigate miracle claims. Dr. Licona, thank you for your time. Can't wait to do part 2 with you on the actual evidence for the resurrection. And for a listening audience, between part 1 and part 2, go ahead and check us out at the website, www.thedailyapologist.com. We're on all social media platforms. We're on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, Pinterest. All that stuff is labeled The Daily Apologist. Go ahead and look at that. And also subscribe to our newsletter, which you can now do on our Facebook page. It's on the left side all the way down. Once again, what a great episode. Thank you, Dr. Licona. Thank you guys for listening in. And remember, equip yourself to engage culture.